Okay, it's hard to believe we're at our last plenary session for the week and for the Propulsion and Energy 2016. Over the last 3 wonderful busy days, we've had over 1,100 attendees, have had the opportunity to attend 7 plenary sessions, 5 Forum 360 panels, more than 200 technical sessions, and over 600 papers presented. You've also had the numerous opportunities to network, collaborate, and plan for the future. In short, it's been busy, it's been jam-packed, and professionally rewarding. I hope you've learned as much as I have. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Please join me one more time in thanking our sponsors, our executive sponsors, GE and Orbital ATK, and our additional sponsors, Arion Technologies, Bastion Technologies, Dunmore Corporation, the Lind Group, Lockheed Martin, and VACO Industries, along with our media sponsors, Space News and Aerospace America. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate all of our award winners from this afternoon's award recognition luncheon. Your dedication and devotion to your fields of endeavor are inspiring to us all. On Monday morning at the plenary session, we discussed the importance of the AIAA Foundation and its role in forming the next generation of the aerospace workforce, and we challenged everyone to be generous and to this important organization. I am happy to report that since then we have raised more than $2,500, all in support of our education programming. Thank you for all your continued and generous support of the AIAA Foundation. Also, if you are tweeting this week, keep it up, we're not done yet. Our Twitter contest will officially close at 3 o'clock following this plenary, and the winners will be naturally tweeted out by 4 p.m. Good luck to everyone participating. We will have a couple of announcements following the session, so please stay with us for those. As we close Propulsion and Energy 2016, we would be remiss if we didn't explore the economic marketplace for our systems and their ancillary technologies. To help us do that, please welcome Pierre Chao, founding partner, Renaissance Strategic Advisors, Incorporated. Pierre, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I realize I'm the post-lunch speaker, so I'm going to kind of stay away from the podium, move back and forth, and maybe that'll keep everybody awake. So the remit for this afternoon is to talk about what we see in the propulsion and power industry, both from a strategic standpoint as well as an economic standpoint. It's going to be more from a 30,000, 40,000 foot level rather than a deeply tactical one. Although as a firm that spends time for a lot of your companies or for actually in sometimes helping the government look at both markets and develop strategies and do mergers and acquisitions, it kind of gives us a perspective in terms of what the big macro trends are sweeping through the industry. And so we thought we would take you through what we're seeing. And there's, in today's environment, certainly no shortage of elements to look at. If we start with the overall kind of macroeconomic outlook, which sort of drives everything that that sweeps through our industry, it's for sure we have been in a very, very sluggish economic environment ever since the 2008 financial crisis. The current forecasts that have been put out over the last few months, both by government organizations like IMF or the World Bank, as well as private Wall Street forecasts, are still for another year of relatively sluggish growth on a global basis. In fact, Brexit and other types of activities over the last few months or weeks these days has actually caused that forecast to come down, to be ratcheted downwards a little bit over the last few weeks. So if there was a slightly more optimistic view about 2 or 3 months ago. And we're looking at, about a 3% sort of, global growth rate. The slight uptick for 2017 that's being forecasted is actually not being driven by the advanced economies. The presumption is that Europe continues to be slow. The really important thing is that China and Asia now continue to slow down. And as you know, they have been the drivers of growth since the '08 financial crisis. And the expected a little bit modest bounce back comes from the US, but more importantly, places like Russia, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. And I point out those countries because, frankly, that's a little bit of a puzzling forecast to the extent that those are more commodity-driven economies, and they have generally been growing because China's demand for those kinds of commodities, as well as US growth and others, have been driving it. So there's a little bit of what we would call a dead cat bounce, I think, that's going on to the extent that there was such a drop or slowdown in 15, 16, I think represents a 17 forecast. Now, there's been deep frustration with this kind of a slow recovery, although frankly, given the kind of financial crisis that we had in '08, which was a debt-driven one, if you go back and look at the last 600 years of economic history, which I have, you find that slow recoveries after debt crises are actually the norm as opposed to a sharp rebound, because people and companies and countries do what you would normally expect to do with any kind of economic growth that comes when you got in trouble because of debt. What do? You work down your debt rather than turn it into consumption, right? And so across the economy, across the globe, what you're seeing is that phenomenon. And in fact, the average American household has been working their way out of debt. American corporations today are holding actually record high levels of cash, and others as we slowly recover. And so at some point in what I would call a strategic planning time frame, call it 5 years, we should start to see the beginnings of a quote-unquote normal type of recovery. But for the next 2 or 3 years, we're still working our way out of this. I would also remind you that when the '08 financial crisis occurred, everybody said, oh, we're going to get a sharp bounce back, it's all going to be fine again, and others were, like ourselves, were sort of saying, we might have the equivalent of the Japanese lost decade of growth, which everybody said you're insane for thinking that. 2017 will mean almost 9 years of the supposed non-lost decade that we've had. The importance also of the slower economy is this has now been matched with stagnating productivity, right, which we haven't been having. And so what the duality of both a slow economic growth and stagnating productivity has been exacerbating this economic divide between what some would call the globally mobile, the globalization beneficiaries, right? People that can move jobs, go to Europe if that's where the jobs are, move to America, go to Asia, et cetera, and sort of ride the globalization wave versus the nots. And this issue is clearly getting manifested on a daily basis in the American political elections, that manifest themselves in the primaries. It's showing up throughout Europe. This was a topic that was at the heart of Brexit, right? This issue of the economic divide and what's going on with sort of the 60, 70, 80% of the global population is key. You're going to sit there and say, well, what's this have to do with power and energy and propulsion? One of the key issues is that the number 2 use of incomes after healthcare is actually spending on energy costs on the average household and actually on the part of corporations, right? And that the amount that you spend is anywhere from 8 to 26%. If you're in the top 10% of the economic pile, you're spending about 8% of your income on energy. If you're in the bottom 50%, which is about $30,000 of income or below, which is actually the median American income, you're spending 26% of your household income on energy costs, right? And that cost is roughly split 2/3 on transportation, which would make sense, right? That's your gas bill. And 1/3 is on all other energy costs, your electric bill, et cetera. So we would submit that if there's this issue of growing economic disparity and clearly going after healthcare costs has been a big political topic and something that's triggering reform, it's inevitable, we think, that at some point there's also this push about, well, what to do about energy costs and the burden that it represents on people. And in some economies, like in a lot of parts of Latin America, the Middle East, or others, people are just being purely subsidized in terms of being given a check in order to handle that. But at some point, there's going to be an innovation imperative, and/or the innovation imperative is going to change, right? The push to date for finding solutions to the global energy problem has been more these days from a green perspective or an environmental perspective. We would argue that you're going to start to see this issue about the economic divide issue, creating yet another innovation imperative in terms of how do I find cheaper sources, more efficient sources of energy in order to relieve part of that burden. And it's going to, the potential for that to be an even stronger driver than the environmental issues, I think, may mount as time goes on, particularly as politicians try to react to this phenomenon that you're seeing there. It's a topic that we haven't discussed a lot, I would argue, and yet one that this industry is going to be asked partly to address. And it will raise this issue in this debate of cheap energy versus clean energy. And I think where the real innovative challenge comes from is, can you make that a false trade-off? Because right now I think there is the presumption that if I want to be a green technology, it's got to be inherently a more expensive one. And the issue is, how do you change that? And there are interesting startups and companies that are looking at a variety of technologies to try to attempt to leverage, that are more amenable, again, for mostly the rest of the world. 1.9 billion people in the world today still do not have access to electricity, which is a shockingly large number. Right? When I read that, I triple-checked that statistic because it doesn't sound right, but that's the case, right? So if you want to sort of conceive of a simple sort of impetus for innovation, which is the theme, I would argue, how do you get 1.9 billion people, access to energy, which then sort of helps solve part of that disparity issue and then takes down the migration problem, right? The migration issue that's in place is because people are moving to where they want to find jobs. They can't find jobs domestically, right? There's an entire global issue tied to this one topic. And oh, by the way, the technologies that, and this is an interesting topic that I've always had and that we've gone through with my NASA friends and others, certain technologies that you want to solve, right, in order to do things like mission to Mars, right? How do I take, cheap, reliable, perpetual power supplies and sources to go to a distant planet is, frankly, we would argue, no different than what some poor village in Mali actually would need in many ways, right? And so there's a conceptual loop, I think, to pull there that you don't hear a lot of people sort of frankly talk about. So if on the global power and energy sort of phenomenon, there's that, and one more set aside, if you talk about the power, it's also why we think that over time, the impetus that was being driven towards the nuclear renaissance, right, that got very much short-circuited because of what happened in Fukushima, comes back only because of this type of phenomenon, overall, as people look for, other sources of energy. On the commercial aerospace side, the big debate that has been going on for the last 18 months, and it's beginning to accelerate, and now with forecasts, again, of yet another year or two of slow economic growth, is, are we finally seeing a slowing down in the super cycle that's been in place? The top chart is traffic growth. The light blue lines is passenger. The red is freight traffic. And freight traffic is usually an early harbinger of economic growth. And so you're seeing the evidence of the slowdown from that perspective. The bottom chart is the last 12 months rolling order books going into Airbus and Boeing, and for the last 12 months or so, we're starting to see this gradual decline. And one of the things that is worthy of note is that the stock markets, when they see this data, right, stock markets are all about acceleration and deceleration, they're not about velocity, right? They're a second-order derivative reactor. And so as they've been watching this slowing down of the order books, the reaction, at least on the part of the stock market, has been, from a period of very high growth to where you can see over the last sort of 12 months or so, the beginnings of slowing down in terms of the stocks related to the commercial aerospace sector. The blue are the big primes like Airbus and Boeing. The reds are the suppliers like the engine companies and others. The green is the S&P 500. You're beginning to see at least the street starting to worry about the slowdown in terms of the cycle. And so the drive for innovation on this front, or in this segment of the marketplace, is I have my bookings that are beginning to slow. In fact, in certain areas, the large primes are starting to talk, large OEMs are starting to talk about doing production rate cuts as opposed to increases, particularly for certain wide-body aircraft, indicating that this super cycle that we've been in since the early 2000s is finally starting to age. I think most people would argue that we're in inning 7. It's still being offset by historically high backlogs, 6-7 years, even if you assume that 1 or 2 years worth of those backlogs, it represents duplication between airlines, both ordering for the same routes. So there's a little bit of garbage in there. But the backlogs are historically high enough that it's still driving the near-term growth in production rates, and therefore the number one topic and debate amongst most of the supply base is still how much capacity do I add on? How do I match the ramp up? How do I make sure I have access to the right raw materials? Lead times are beginning to stretch. How do I find alternate materials to use because some of the lead times are stretching? The other thing that's also in place is the global competitive landscape also continues to evolve, right? Where people were thinking Bombardier might be slipping out of the marketplace because they were struggling with their C-Series, and other competitors. The recent investment by the Canadian government and recent order for the C-Series is keeping the global landscape of 2 major players with 2 sort of secondary in the form of Embraer and Bombardier still there, with also the Chinese and the Russians trying to develop their own aircraft. So the push for innovation here, which has been how do we meet the ever-increasing environmental standards and noise standards that are being put into place, that have been driving the development cycles over the last couple of years, as well as fuel efficiency. We think that continues for the next 2, 3, 4 years, just the same way that it's been driving development and the push for innovation over the last sort of 5 to 7 years. The element that's now starting to loom yet again within a strategic planning time frame, though, is at what point do Boeing and Airbus finally get to the point of doing a clean sheet of paper redesign of the whole narrow-body fleets, right? Which today we're still doing everything off of 1960s, 1970s, 1980s designs at its heart, and we've been extending them through because of propulsion and re-engineering them. And with the decision to go with the Neo and the Max, they have pushed off that decision for another 5 years. But if you're doing strategic planning and doing long-term technology investing, that decision point is looming back again in terms of, are they going to do a clean sheet of paper design within the next 5 to 10 years? What does that clean sheet of paper design look like? And the number one thing is that the airlines are pushing back on and sort of saying, if you do that, we want to see yet another step function change in terms of performance. And it's looking like propulsion, once again, will have to step up to the plate in order to deliver that. And so I know the GE and Pratt teams and Rolls teams are just rolling off the last batch of design and development. In fact, in some ways, they're still in the midst of it. But I think already we have to look over the horizon into what the next generation starts to look like, unless there's fundamental changes on the aerostructure side, and even though we're starting to see some conceptual experimentation with alternate designs for aircraft, those still look like it's beyond sort of this cycle. And so the push for innovation is still back onto the propulsion side, and where it always has been. I would also note, and it's interesting that Ariane, for example, is one of the sponsors, the place of can we get economically viable supersonic, commercial traffic still seems to be now left in the realm of supersonic business jets, and the advances are there's very decent progress being made, I would argue, and I think it'll be interesting to sort of see, where that market breaks open. But we're actually relatively optimistic that there is a slice for that, for those kinds of markets, and it's always been the return to supersonic, obviously, that kind of changes that does begin to sort of change the landscape structurally, right? It was the leap from pistons to jets that made the major change in commercial aerospace, and we've always been waiting to see, can you get from subsonic to supersonic on the commercial side. On the space market, and this is something you have been talking, I understand, quite a bit about over the last sort of 2 days. The element on the space market that we see is obviously the return of the LEO market, with the various constellations that are in play. The Orville and Wilbur Wrights of the 21st century are in full throttle relative to the innovation that's underway, and so there's not much for me to say relative to that because it's been underway. We'll have to sort of see whether there are fortunes to be made, or is the reverse joke, right? How do you make millions in commercial space? Start with billions. It turns out to be more true or not, but I think so that element is playing itself out. Clearly, I think the next strategic thing to look at is going to be less on the light side, because there has been sufficient innovation. It's what goes on the heavy side, right? And there's a certain amount of geopolitics that plays in that, to the extent of if we lose access, or we're increasingly concerned about access to Russian technology. So therefore, if we're going to create an indigenous, new set of engines back domestically, is there the political will, the dollars, and something different and new in order to deliver, is one element. But I would argue that if you're looking for places of, frankly, of new innovation, it's going to be on the heavy side. The other element that taps back into the national security component of it is actually also on-orbit propulsion, as we start to look for more agile satellites, and given a potentially more hostile environment in space than we've been used to. It's been a tough place to be, the space market, over the last couple of years, for sure, as anybody knows who's been in the satellite production side or the launch. It looks like we have a little bit of relief that's going to come again from the light side, as these new LEO constellations finally get up there. Although I would note that they are currently right now going into like OneWeb and others are going into their financing phases where they need to get the next batch of dollars. Having been someone who was there during the Kistler Aerospace days and the generation one of all of that, as well as Iridium and Globalstar, right? There's a certain amount of caution on the part of the investment community in Wall Street about these projects, in order to sort of make sure that we have fully learned our lessons from the last time around, and we sort of know what we're doing this time around. The element that's clearly different is that the underlying cost structures relative towards building small sats, microsats, is kind of changed. And so hopefully that changes the overall economic picture. At least that's what people are looking for. And so we're seeing some interesting innovations, frankly, also on that front as well. If I then sort of switch to the national security picture, right, having sort of spent time on the macro, the commercial aerospace, the space, now on national security, There is no shortage of national security challenges, out there in the landscape. Anyone who just spends 15 minutes on, CNN or any television station knows that. I'm stating the obvious in terms of what's there. The rising complexity of the challenges and the wide range, I think, is what's beginning to sort of overwhelm most governments, or even or the DoD, as they sit there and try to conceptualize their way through the problem. And for some time now, we've been talking about the notion that we've had a barbell-shaped national security sort of environment. One end of the barbell that's been pinned or tied or related to counterinsurgency, the war against Islamic extremism, the war against global terror, whatever euphemism you want to use, but it's one that's been very much sort of boots on the ground, tied to counterinsurgency oriented, deeply dependent on persistent surveillance and intelligence, the search for the needle in the haystack being the critical sets of technologies. And these days, I'm not only looking for the needle in the haystack, I'm looking for the straws of hay turning into needles, right, hiding inside. And so the large data analytics problem that it represents being deeply embedded in there. The other end of the barbell has been the classical sort of national security challenge of near-peer companies or threats, and you can almost sort of take all the bad actors in the world and draw a circle around them, and those are the countries that are worried about it. So North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, China these days, and Russia these days, rising in concern. And so if over the last 15 years, the one end of the barbell was much larger overall, the rising threats, and in particular activities like what the Russians did in the Ukraine, and frankly, they just did something that was not supposed to occur in the 21st century, right? On the European landmass, you had a country grab a piece of another country and occupy it and take it, right? Supposedly, that's not supposed to be going on. There was actually one defense company that nominated Putin their Employee of the Year. But it has sort of re-raised the specter of the quote-unquote higher-end fight, back on the landscape. You can talk to the Philippines, the Vietnamese, the Thai about China and the South China Sea, and the Japanese. Talk to the Saudis about Iran, right, in terms of, and so the other end of the barbell is beginning to sort of re-rise in importance, and that's relevant because in many ways this is being done within the context that the basic way of warfare that America has adopted since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, is being degraded by, which is one centered on technological superiority, has been and is being steadily eroded by adversary improvements in a wide range of technologies, right? They are not stupid. They have seen where our advantages are, and they're beginning to develop a set of technologies in order to offset that. And so the counter back against this erosion of this technological superiority that's been eroded over the last 10 years is feeding into the Pentagon's thinking, this talk of what they're calling the third offset. Right? For those of you who are not familiar, there have been two prior sort of offset technology strategies in the last 70 years or so by America. Right? There was the first offset, which occurred after the end of the Second World War, which was essentially the answer to the problem of, wow, we don't want to do that again being the Second World War, and we don't want to have to conscript millions of Americans in order to fight another land war in Eurasia. So how do I develop a technological advantage or some sort of offset against the numerical superiority of the Eastern Bloc? The technological answer at the time was nuclear weapons, right? We developed a pentomic military that did everything from fleet ballistic missile submarines to ICBMs to bombers to nuclear mortars, right? They clearly went overboard. But it was the technological sort of offset against a problem of scale that the other side had. Fast forward 20 years, the Soviets catch up in nuclear weapons. There's mutually assured destruction. We have détente, it's frozen there. And I had my second problem of scale, which was in conventional weapons. In Europe, the Soviets had an advantage, and they had a growing, they were closing the gap in terms of air-to-air and anti-air defense, so slowing down our abilities for bombers to penetrate. And so the second question again was asked, how do I offset this numerical and scale superiority of the Soviets with technology? And we came up with stealth and GPS and precision-guided weapons, right? Hence the second offset. Fast forward another now 20 or 30 years, there are other countries that are getting the equivalent amount of precision. They're beginning to, figure out ways to degrade stealth, etc. And the Pentagon is asking the same question. How do I offset a scale problem? If the Chinese or someone can launch 100 missiles against the one carrier, they only need to get one through, right? How do I offset that scale problem with a set of technologies and concepts? And there isn't a set answer. There are lots of people tossing up a variety of answers that include things like robotics and automation and directed energy and others, but the field in some ways is wide open in terms of trying to sort that out. And because there's a concern about this higher end, there's another round of technological innovation and sort of conceptualization of how to regain an asymmetric advantage technologically that is actually starting to shift dollars and investment and drive a push for sort of fundamental innovation, right? And so on the national security side, if we're seeing pretty much across the world a fragmenting world, old institutions that, in many ways you could sit there and say the post-Cold War era has now just started, right? It didn't start in 1991. Almost everything was kind of frozen into place. It's taken about 10, 15 years for the fragmentation to really occur, and things like Brexit. Now the Catalans are sort of saying, I don't know if I really want to be part of Spain. The Scots are really getting themselves geared up, right? The faces are getting painted blue again, so, off they go. The Wallonians are looking at, saying, I'm not really Belgian, right? So you're seeing a fragmentation starting that, ironically enough, a globalized set of telecommunications makes it easier to do, right, rather than harder. And the second bullet is tied to the current political debate that's underway, right? You have a presidential candidate sort of saying, maybe we shouldn't be in places like NATO and others. Maybe we ought to be pulling backwards and focus in on ourselves. We've seen that before. We did that in the 20s and 30s, right? If you have a military that is a U.S. that is potentially less forward deployed because we feed an isolationist, it's probably too strong to use the word isolationist, but at least, an America Firster sort of streak, and the technological environment gets much more contested, right? That all pushes for a set of answers that relate to longer range and faster sets of capability sets, because I have to get to the problem quicker than I had, which is why the re-rise in fascination and work on hypersonics, right, which had been laying kind of fallow for a while, although you could see these trends coming. You could sit there and say 5 years ago, I'll bet you dollars to donuts it's going to come back at some point in the next 5 to 10 years. Now I'm no longer saying anything predictive. I would sit there and say it's here upon us in terms of those kinds of technologies. If not, other kinds of, ramjets, et cetera, as we sort of look at not going fast by going fast straight, but now starting to follow the parabolic curves, right, in terms of how do I get from here to the Pacific very quickly. That set of technologies, I would argue, is this community's contribution into the answer to part of the third offset problem, right, on that end. And I suspect you're going to see dollars being put against it and, a deep amount of interest. The other place which answers the other end of the barbell, the part of the barbell that's related to the counterinsurgency fight, to the terrorism problem, the issue of longer persistence, right? How do I maintain a UAV or an airship or whatever, the ability to have, surveillance of an area on a persistent basis, 24/7, 365, right? And the experiments that are being done and the UAV players that are working on long endurance UAVs and high altitude UAVs, et cetera, are all sort of frankly playing into that. And the interface between the manned aircraft world, the UAV world, and the satellite world, right, I think will begin to collapse in some ways as we answer the problem across all three dimensions in order to do that. The more and more you sort of go down the path of wanting to do something about that, unfortunately, we sort of get more and more into this world of Big Brother that's always watching, right? And so that will obviously also feed, other issues about privacy and what do you do about that. Also, this is probably. This actually is an iPhone with a BlackBerry keyboard, so you may not recognize it. This is as much of a persistent surveillance device as anything, actually, also, by the way, right? It's giving away my location, exactly what I do, how much my heart is beating, how many steps I'm taking, what I'm eating, blah, blah, 24/7, 365, and actually I'm voluntarily, every time I click yes to every single one of those downloads, I'm voluntarily giving it away, right? So, there's I guess there's another angle to that. And so the strategic pivot on the innovation front, I would argue, is if over the last 10 years, the ask on the part of the government on this front has been, help me find efficiency or, better technologies, I think we're back into a world where performance becomes the driving element rather than efficiency in terms of that. It's probably a false dichotomy to put. I'm talking about like sort of, degrees of emphasis rather than sitting there saying I'm willing to throw it all away. I'm willing to pay anything for performance. It's not, but there is, to the extent that the ability to deliver a certain set of performance, I think becomes a little bit more important than what it was over the last 5 or 10 years relative versus, cost as the independent variable, or how do I get something to work, on a cheaper fashion. And from a stock market perspective, from the guys on Wall Street, what's interesting is defense stocks are now trading at their sort of 10-year highs. And in fact, in terms of multiples, they are approaching sort of 30-year highs in terms of valuation levels that the stock market is ready or willing to put onto defense companies. So if in 2008, 2009, that big dip that you saw down there, the stock market was almost pricing the entirety of the slowdown of U.S. defense spending 5 years ahead of time, you can almost argue that they're pricing in the entirety of a potential upturn in defense spending for the next 5 or 6 years, today. There's a little bit of a phenomenon that because the rest of the world, it's what I call the we suck less phenomenon, that because the rest of the world and there's fewer places to invest your money, that defense is looking like a relatively safer place, that people are actually investing in defense stocks. From a defensive standpoint, that's also, that's been lifting and boosting the performance of the defense primes. But there's also a sense that we have hit the bottom in terms of defense spending. and certainly the Pentagon is starting to talk again about reinvesting in technology and reinvesting in innovation overall. It will take a certain amount of time to see those dollars truly shift, right, and turn the rhetoric into dollars. But once again, since Wall Street is more about predicting the future and more about second-order derivative changes, we've gone from a declining defense budget to a flat one, and now the prospect of an increasing one. I've certainly changed the acceleration of the curve, from that perspective. And what's interesting is if I take a look at propulsion-related stocks or companies, the blue is an index or an aggregate of propulsion-related companies. It's not a very pure one because there's not a lot of pure play propulsion companies. Rolls-Royce, Aerojet are in that index clearly, but also companies like GE and United Technologies that clearly have a lot of other things inside of them. But it serves as a relatively decent proxy. I think the decline and then the pop back up has been a little bit of this reaction about how much influence the commercial aerospace industry has on all of us, both as suppliers, as major suppliers in terms of engines, but as well as lower tier suppliers in the mechanical and the structural and hydraulic side of the marketplace, influences the overall economic fortunes of it. But that recent uptick and rebound is, I think, also tied to improving prospects relative to the defense or national security side of the market space. The fact that so the left side of that chart is the raw stock price performance. The green is actually the S&P 500. So we've actually, as an industry, we've outperformed the overall market over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. Once again, I'll say the we suck less phenomenon is in play. And the right side is the valuation levels, or how much people are willing to pay for your kinds of companies. We're near sort of, for sure, 5-year highs, although it's kind of plateaued out as people are trying to decide, I think, in a significant fashion, which way or where is the commercial aerospace cycle going to go. So that's the public markets. We spend quite a bit of time with venture capitalists and private equity firms. The venture capitalists, for sure, are now finally starting to look at new space more as an institutional basis, because we've matured it enough, I think, where they're now at the edges of sort of seeing where, if they want to play and where they want to play. The private equity players that are usually the first movers and investors in overall companies are more starting to sell off their commercial aerospace exposure and are actually starting to, there's more of a bias of selling off commercial aerospace and more of a bias of beginning to look at defense again, which is almost the exact opposite of where it's been over the last 3 or 4 years. That's probably the biggest shift that I've seen in the last 9 months in terms of overall behavior. So that was a very quick, skipping of the rock across the pond in terms of the overall sector. We've left plenty of time, so you can either use it for some Q&A that we're going to do, and then we'll see if we can bake in a little bit of a break between that and the next sessions.
Okay, well, thank you, Pierre. Excellent, very informative. We do have Q&A. The way we do it here is we have this nice little tablet that I get all the questions and I get to ask.
Good, all right.
So I'm just going to work off the list pretty much as people voted. The highest rated question for you is, could you comment on where you see advanced nuclear technology fitting into the future energy markets?
Yeah, I alluded to it a little bit. We were starting to spend quite a bit of time when the nuclear renaissance was sort of getting going and looking at small nuclear reactors and others. I think that the macro fundamentals are still in place, that over time it brings that market back, right? From the perspective of, what I saw as the key thing that kind of changed it was when Greenpeace started to talk about nuclear as a cleaner technology than others. I thought was a big conceptual break, right? Then of course you have Fukushima and everybody sort of stops. But the fundamentals in place, I think, are still there, and there's certain parts of the world where it's going to be their only answer and their only alternative. And so obviously the innovation and the work still remains in terms of how do you make it as safe as possible, self-contained, and others. And there's also an element, I think, that's tied to the space community as they sort of also look at those kinds of technologies. So that the triangle between the nuclear navy that has that culture and is working on those all the time, working on those technologies, what's going on in the commercial world and some parts of the space community, out of that cluster, there's something to be done there. Frankly, I'd keep watching also in terms of what the Chinese are doing with the pebble reactors as a way to kind of get from here to there.
So you see it coming?
I see it coming.
Excellent. Now, you won't be surprised that this is a high-rated question, particularly given the fact that we've got 2 conventions behind us. Well, almost 2 conventions behind us. In terms of the election, regardless of who wins, what, quote, bipartisan trends do you see playing out?
That's an interesting question. You have to sort of work your way through, each of the different sectors, because I think it'll be different, right? For space, I actually think that would be relatively bipartisan. I'm not sort of seeing anything on one side or the other that's saying, I'm going to gut NASA or get rid of it, or, we don't care about space exploration or others. And I think we had hit that low point in NASA spending. We've got a decent trend. At worst, I think that as there's pressure, upward pressure on defense budget, the bargain will hold that as defense numbers go up, non-defense discretionary dollars will also go up, and that will create an opening room for NASA to keep doing that. And Florida, Texas remain important political states, and we were talking at lunch about how the industry is spread throughout the country. So I think that one will remain relatively, bipartisan. Commercial aerospace, that's another one that's become bipartisan to the extent that now both parties are starting to hammer against global trade, WTO, and so if we start doing 1920s-like economic behavior that starts putting up trade barriers and slows global growth, that's going to accelerate the slowdown in the commercial aerospace market, right? Certainly on the freight side, right? Period, full stop. And so we'll have to watch that in terms of, does it increase now the probability of the cycle slowing down? Defense is one where I think it gets bifurcated in a whole bunch of different ways. And that loops back to that issue of, do we pull back from, leaning forward, right? That's right now that the Trump position has been, let's come home. The Clinton administration, or potential, platform position has been, we need to remain engaged around the world, and so I think that's one where you would see a difference.
Okay, thank you. Next one, do you see China being able to threaten the Boeing Airbus duopoly in commercial aviation in the near future?
Yes, but not in the near future, right? So we have finally gotten to a duopoly for the first time since Orville and Wilbur Wright began to fly. I think that's partly the reason why there's been rationality in the system. I don't believe in the inherent genetics of the airlines. I think they're I've told them to their face, they're inherently insane, when it comes down to it, and can't control themselves. The only reason why they've been able to control themselves is because we've been throttling back production, frankly. And each time that but that throttling of production is exactly what creates the opening for a third player to come in there and sit there and say, oh, I can give you something, right? So clearly, Embraer and Bombardier are looking to feed into that. The Chinese, there's been no point in history where there's been a country that hasn't had a major domestic market that hasn't created a major domestic player in the aerospace industry. The Russians, right? The Europeans, the Americans. And so I think it's inevitable that the Chinese will do it, and they're trying to do it. Now, you have to remember, though, it took Airbus 25 years, right, to become a major player. It's more, and as everybody here knows, it's more than just building airplanes. It's can you create a global system of support and maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's a threat for this cycle. I don't think it's a threat even probably for the next cycle. But you give me 2 cycles from now, and I guarantee you there'll at least be a major Asian player, more than likely a Chinese player.
Okay, great. Let's see, do you think there is a role for a reusable launch system in access to space, with the premise being that reusability will reduce cost of access to space?
Yes, if the premise is true. So you've got to reverse the equation. You give me the secondary, and then I'll tell you, and that's the whole game that everybody's
I'm just asking the questions the way I get them.
That's the whole game that everybody's trying to get at and do that. And I think that's what we're centering the innovations on, right? We're still, well, I mean, you guys are living and breathing this market on a daily basis. But I'll tell you, that's exactly also what the investors are trying to gauge and test, right? The ones who are being asked to, step up to the plate, because we've now hit the point where there's been a whole bunch of players that have, hey, I've demonstrated it, right? I've done the $50 million, the $100 million, even the $200 million, $500 million investment. Now I need the $2 billion, right? And so it's, can you scale, above and beyond where you are today and from the demonstrations? And so the question should be reversed on its head. I ask you back as technologists, right? Can we get there? But that's what's needed, I think, to close the loop.
Okay, now you mentioned a possible break. I'm getting worried about that because I keep watching the questions roll in. But that's good. Everybody's engaged. Do you see a decentralized energy generation and storage as an imperative for grid resilience, national security concerns, et cetera?
That's a fascinating question. Yes, but I'll bet you that the imperative doesn't, that the answer, like usual, right? Sometimes it's a biologist walking past the chemist's office to give you the answer, that you're more likely to see that develop because of the small energy problem that needs to be solved in the third world, right? That creates the imperative that then lets you develop the technology you can then re-implement back for that reason. I don't see, American utilities sitting there going, yes, I will voluntarily spend $1 billion in order, to not have that one big coal-fired plant, and I'm going to do, 4 different plants scattered around Maryland just for national security reasons. They're not the ones to drive that. It'll be because somebody else solved it for another problem, right? Hey, I need local power somewhere else, or I need a cheap way to install power in the third world. And oh, by the way, did you know, now I can also do that back in Maryland and do it cost effectively, that I think ends up driving that phenomenon. And I think it's the need to do that that's going to drive the impetus for those kinds of technologies. The storage and transmission, I think, and control become the key drivers there on that set of technologies.
Okay. Do you think there's a future of, you mentioned heavy payloads and heavy launch vehicles. Do you think in the future, if launch is going to be more focused on heavier payloads, does that mean that there needs to be a disaggregation that will play a role in the future of space?
So it's another place where I think that you're seeing the barbell starting to develop. Everything says, and in particular, that that world of decreasing technological advantage. I mean, one of the areas and one of the places, and these changes in technology and these changes sometimes they're predictable, disruptive events. Everybody sits there and how can you predict a disruption, right? That's one where it's more like tectonic plates, right? Where pressure builds until something then causes it to slip. It's not like that no one knew that ASAT and vulnerability of space was unknown, right? Mm-hmm. You just needed somebody to actually do something about it and sort of make it manifest. Same thing with global terrorism, right? It's not like Tom Clancy put in his book the year before about an airplane going into a building. Somebody then did it, tectonic plate shifts, it becomes visible, right? Mm-hmm. And so we had that, I think, in space. The ability to now think that it's no longer an open commons that's a given, which means I need to protect myself, which means I need to get more mobile and or more fragmented. I think those are all the things that are driving the push towards disaggregation, mm-hmm. which then is driving the need for, okay, well, how can I get that and be agile? But yet there's going to be a certain set of capabilities where having it concentrated large capability sets that will keep the heavy side alive, right? So it's back to this barbell end, and what I haven't seen yet, although I guess the SpaceX guys are telling me, is how can I bridge the two of them together, mm-hmm. right? Now, if you could be really clever and bridge both sides, right. Now you've got something, and so right now I have two sets of players trying to answer the world for both of them, and there's probably too many trying to solve both ends, right?
Okay, big aerospace firms have been merging and acquiring each other. It changes on me in real time. Big aerospace firms have been merging and acquiring each other again. How is that impacting innovation and investment?
That's an interesting question. So on the large hardware side, we have probably hit stability, and certainly the Pentagon has been telling the large aerospace primes, we're not going to allow further consolidation amongst the major players. The sale of Sikorsky to Lockheed, was not deemed to be, a major change from that perspective. And what's interesting about this innovation debate, and I think we've been having a false debate about it to the extent of only small can be innovative and large can't. I think it's an issue of scale, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of, and what kinds of innovation do you want, right? In terms of, is it incremental versus disruptive versus others? And so don't tell Northrop Grumman that they weren't innovative in some ways about the answer to the long-range strike bomber, or actually any of the bidders, right? And that large-scale problem is probably, better suited for a larger company with large scale in order to address. Now, you want to, come up with a radically different answer to the underwater surveillance problem? Maybe I might need 5 people in a garage coming up with something, interestingly unique. But then when it comes time to developing the entire system of a global, maritime 24/7, 365 surveillance basis covering every ocean, I'm not going to trust a 5-person company in order to do that, right? And so I think what you're seeing is that in places where scale doesn't matter in terms of levels of innovation, so IT, software, data, that's where the small startups are doing really well. UAVs is another interesting place because it's actually really about the sensors. The thing can be built by anybody. And in places where I have large-scale problems, I think that's where the larger companies are benefiting and can deliver, right? And ultimately, where you really need the large players, and this is why I think the aerospace defense is starting to follow the biotech pharma model, right? The pharmaceutical guys represent the access to market. The big defense companies are the ones that know how to deal with the insane customer called the Pentagon that has all these Byzantine rules that every time they sit there and say, I want to deal with commercial companies, those commercial companies, the first time they get a knock on the door by the DCAA, they go running away in horror, or the first time they see the federal acquisition regulations, they sit there and say, oh my God, I don't want to deal with those, with those people. And off they go. And so there's a role, I would argue, that the large players play. And it's this whole sense that I need an innovation ecosystem, rather than a cartoonish view of small, innovative, large, horrible, that I think that's going to continue to evolve.
Okay, thank you. The next one, will ITAR isolationism put the U.S. into a technologically isolated position?
Yes. Look, before I started Renaissance, I worked at a think tank where getting the reform on the space side was sort of one of my big projects, and we finally got that done. It took 10 years of banging heads against brick walls, right? But ITAR is an issue. It's a serious issue, right? They've gotten a little bit better, and they're trying to reform it, and they're trying to do some work. So I think it's gradually getting better. But I've personally participated in a set of activities where a global telecom player was told, either you get rid of your U.S. government NSA-oriented business, or you're not going to sell a single box in China. And guess what they decided to do? They got rid of their U.S. NSA business, right? And that's a problem because now we're dark on their technologies, right? And so, luckily, it's a topic that I think we've made some progress overall in terms of sensitivity towards it and a willingness to try to change it. Anyone who is dealing with ITAR currently can, feel free to throw a tomato at me, and sort of sit there and say, it hasn't gotten that much better. But I would argue that the recognition that there's a serious problem, and the fact that we're sort of working away, and I know AIAA, lots of institutions, we keep working at it. Keep banging the gong.
Okay, do you see the recent increase in your chart with the on the defense stocks as a short-term or a long-term?
I'm afraid it's a little bit of a short-term because there is that hiding in defense because defense is defensive. That when the rest of the economy begins to get a little bit better, when the Fed starts to raise interest rates, right now you're getting nothing by putting money away in the bank, and so defense companies are giving dividends in 2, 3, 4, 5%, and so it's become a substitute for putting your money in treasuries and other things. That can't last forever. So that part of the phenomenon will cause some of that to come back down. So everybody's got to be a little bit careful, sort of, to not think that it's too permanent.
How would you rate China's antagonism in terms of rendering them a strategic threat rather than a powerful potential ally?
So China is probably much more of a conundrum than Russia in some ways, only because, one of the top 3 holders of our debt, their economy is tied to ours. There's all those elements. The part that's been, frankly, though, interesting to watch or startling to watch is their behavior in the South China Sea throughout their neighbors in China has turned far more bellicose and far more sort of in your face in the last 2 or 3 years than it has been before. And so I think the risk is of a miscalculation or something. The guys that are barrel rolling our airplanes are the top pilots. What happens when a second-rate one decides to emulate his buddy and then smacks into something, or there's an incident? And frankly, they're far more cautious around us. But what happens if they do something with a Philippine boat or a Vietnamese boat or Thai, or a Japanese even, which is why the Japanese have gone non-linear in terms of the China threat. That becomes a risk. There is, I think, there's more sense of a grand scheme to try to balance because we know that we're economically tied. But I will tell you, France and Germany were more economically tied than ever before prior to World War I, right? So it's not necessarily, something that sits there and says you don't go to war against each other just because of those economic ties, right? But it seems to be acting as the dampener and the dampener rod in the mechanism, but it won't prevent a miscalculation. Right? Russia is the bigger issue because there's a capability, and they've now shown intent and actually action. Like I said, they have grabbed a country, and let me tell you, if you're in the Baltics, you're getting really worried. And I had a fascinating conversation with the Secretary of Defense of Poland once where he sat there and said, look, for you guys, this is all theoretical. For me, you know, I have a budget 1/20th of yours. I'm trying to upgrade my equipment to NATO standard from Soviet. I'm trying to be a good partner. I'm in Afghanistan, I'm in Iraq. And oh, by the way, I have neighbors that have crossed my border with routine regularity about every 50 years for the last 2,000, right? And I'm overdue. So you know, for them, it's really visceral. And when you sit there and see what's going on in Crimea and others, there's a whole bunch of people that are really, really nervous.
I'm actually glad you went to that point. I wasn't going to go there, but we have family history with Estonia. And you talk about a group that is really nervous right now.
Right.
How would you see the impact of new space on the launch industry?
So right now, I think it's the prospect of new space that's sort of driving and is acting as sort of the fuel forward for investment, which is why I think the real critical point is less about the new space launcher guys that are trying to get ready and feed a market, but when I ask everybody, or if I stack up all the business plans of all the ventures in place, it equals to 200-300% of the market in terms of all the new space satellite ventures that are going to go up. So somebody's not going to make it. Mm-hmm. And it's also why they're all staring at the financeability and the viability that those guys can get the money so that way they can buy the launches in order to go, right? And the insidious part is everybody's going to be able to get their first 50 million to get the first 8, 9, or whatever up into orbit. It's then when they have to put up the next 100 or 200, right, where the big dollars start to show up in terms of. So I think it's gone from a technological challenge, not to dismiss that, to now one of a financing challenge of can we finance the wave of new space satellite guys that want to get everything up in order to fuel the race that's going on the launcher side. This is all going to get played out in the next 3 years, right? If you go down the list of who wants to be up there quickly, it's all going to show up in the next 3 years or so.
Okay, this is a really interesting question. We've been talking basically in the context that the price of oil is sitting here. What happens, in your estimation, if the price of oil gets back to that $100 a barrel plus? Does that affect any of the discussion we've had today?
Yes, in particular related to obviously the two spots, right? One, national security, right? So in terms of customer sets, how much money do they have in order to, and how much conflict there is in and around that. It obviously plays far more into the commercial aerospace side. I think they're benefiting a little bit from a Goldilocks level of fuel price to the extent that, obviously after labor, right, fuel is the second largest cost that the airlines have. And so they've been benefiting from that low fuel level. We're finally getting the retirement of the old airplanes out of the system that had been forecasted for years and years and years, but they still stuck, and now I'm working my way out. You have a sharp spike, one usually that trashes the airlines because they can't react fast enough to that, so that's one, it hurts the airline financials. And two, it probably then starts to impact the replacement cycle in terms of next gen versus old gen types of engines. And so it's always been an oil shock that has stopped an aerospace cycle at least since the 50s.
Okay, great, thank you. Next one is, you are a keen student of historical trends. In spite of the rhetoric shown on the 24/7 news cycles and the social media, do you see any new issues that would buck the historic megatrends?
Oh, great question. That's a fantastic question. What's interesting, we're actually starting to work on a project. One of the CEOs of the companies is a physicist, and so I mentioned the word boundary conditions and got him all really excited because he's like, And now you're talking my language, right? And in whoever asked the question, you've essentially asked, a boundary question, right, in terms of the trends. And as we do our forecasting and a lot of scenario-based planning work, right, we're always very careful to separate out cyclical trends from, I guess, secular trends and others. And the problem is, if you're long enough student of history, everything sort of gets repeated. And so I think the places where you would look for what's going to get out of there are plenty of things that for sure are pushing at the edges of the 50-year, boundaries of what were perceived to be norms, and this whole issue of fragmentation and is the right time frame to be thinking of as an analog the late 1800s to the 1920s, more so than people sort of saying, the 50s as the right area. And I point to that period, high technological change, right? At that time, it was electricity and steam and steel and the Industrial Revolution, essentially onshoring, which drove huge social change, right? So we have our own versions of the lights today, and all that. Big changes in parties that were done for that. I had an economic slowdown, and I also had a fundamental change in the national security environment. So indulge me for 30 seconds, because I do this for people.
You have plenty of time.
In terms of doing this, I do these 20-year hops for people, because every time oftentimes we do these things and people sit there and say, the world pretty much kind of stays within we know it. It doesn't change that much, right? So linear forecasting is okay to do. But if you think about it and sort of do 20-year hops, and you start in 1900, right? So I've got the Brits against the French. The Germans are sort of a middling power. The United States is a hemispheric power, off on its own. Land warfare sort of dominates, cavalry, et cetera. And that's sort of the way the world looks. I hop forward 20 years, 1920. I just had, 200-year enemies, the French and the British, get together and fight against the Germans and defeated them. I created this entirely new domain of warfare called the air, right? That now just suddenly showed up, and a whole industry around that in that 20-year sort of time frame. Go 20 more years, 1940. Germany rules all of Europe, right? Soviet Union is pushed to its back. United States is swearing they will not get involved in this war, in fact, doing everything they can not to. And I have a whole new domain of warfare that's been invented in the electromagnetic spectrum, because I have radio, radar, et cetera. 20 years forward, 1960, Germany is shattered and divided. The Soviet Union now has half of Europe. United States is now the major power. And I have just created this whole new domain called space, right? 20 years forward, Soviet Union is at its peak. It just invaded Afghanistan. It looks like we're losing. Japan Inc. is on the rise. America's on its back. Everything's horrible, right? I've created a new domain called IT, right? 20 years forward, Soviet Union's gone. Piece of ash heap of history. United States sole superpower, right? New domain, in this case, cyber, right? Data, which is riding off of IT. But really the big change overall was actually outsourcing government functions and the rise of professional services companies, right? So now I say 2020, right? Or I go from here and I go, and whoever asked, what's the boundary conditions that change? 20 years from now, what's fundamentally changed in that? Any one of the people that we call allies could be different. I was born in France, I'll tell you, in Europe, there's beneath that veneer of civilization, there's a dark streak, right? You push Europeans far enough, bad things happen, or they do bad things to themselves. There's an isolationist streak in America that goes back to, George Washington. There's lots of things that you just don't know, that if you scratch and tap which way it goes. I think the question is asked correctly, though, of despite what all the variables could be, and the variables have now just widened out, what stays common throughout all of them, right? And there are certain parts of it that, you know, chances are in the next 20 years, the U.S. still remains a major power, and we have global obligations, and then that becomes the real trick. And in the meantime, while you're going through all these oscillations, and you sit there and say that the world is a horrible place, if you ask, I would argue, the average French farmer, the last 60 years has probably been the best 60 years in the last 3,000, because by now, somebody would have crossed that farm, burned them out, thrown them out, right? You know, now ask the same question to somebody in Baghdad, they'll give you a different answer, right? So it's a fascinating question. The place where you're going to keep busting through the boundaries and that keeps pushing is where technology, you know, is just the absorption of technology that keeps accelerating on a greater and greater basis, right? 20, two more Moore's law cycles. I can put enough transistors on a chip to equal the number of neurons in the human brain. I have no idea what the hell that means, but that's going to mean something, right? From the perspective of what it means in terms of the implications of that, right? And if I do that 20-year hop, I'll bet you bio is that new domain. For as frightening as that sounds, biotech is that new domain.
Interesting. A lot to think about out of that one.
You don't want to think about that one too long, actually. It's not a pleasant one.
Well, actually, that's a good one at the bar. Let's see. One question that's been on here for a while, and I'm trying to make sure I find it. All of a sudden, I've lost it. Oh, well. One more quick question, then I think we probably ought to plan on wrapping up. This is rather, here it is. What strategies for making business with a new narrow-body design, what are the strategies for making business with a new narrow-body design, and should one innovate, wait, or adopt?
That's a great question. Wait and adopt has been the valid one for the last 10 years. It's worked really well. My fear, I'm always the natural contrarian, right? So if something keeps going on for a little too long, you sort of look for when you're going to go from one boundary condition to the other. It starts to sit there and say that looking around for innovation is becoming the answer, right? Because if everyone else is in that mode, that screams then for strategic breakout. And say what you will about the geared turbofan, right, which was really controversial for quite some time, but in the end, it has sort of paid off, right, from that perspective. So I think that equivalent is there. And I also say that just because from the simple presumption that it's going to take time to find and do that, and I don't think the companies will have the tolerance for doing the burst of investment in a short time frame at the magnitude needed to catch up if you weren't trying to incrementally, if you weren't trying to do that innovation all along.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question and then wrap things up. What do you think the saturation level is for pulling venture capital into emerging space or new space, and have we reached it?
We haven't. It's a fantastic way. We haven't reached it because it hasn't. I would argue because it hasn't started. Right. The venture capital world has been playing on the fringes and has been doing some minor things. We've played in that world. We had to have the billionaire class come in and the angel investors. And the reason why I say this is because it's been primarily funded by angel investors, which I'm going to put into a different category than your institutional venture capitalists, right? And so to date, it's been the realm of the angel investors, the billionaires who were the Apollo generation. They were inspired and decided they want to put money to work. We have not hit the institutional class venture capitalists. I think they're about to get tested because they're the only one, they're going to be asked to invest in the new space, satellite constellations and others. that's going to give us the opportunity to sort of test, and then we'll have the normal capital markets that will come into play as we really get those going. So it's yet to be tested. There's probably $100 million in, what I would call venture capital money chasing this market. Maybe call it $100 to $300 million, I would guess. That's a pure guess on my part. There's probably a statistic that you can find. There's a demand for 3 times that amount, right? This is why Space Florida and other, quasi-governmental players, that's another place where people are having to play.
Okay, well, Pierre, thank you so much for sharing your insights through all of this. This has been fascinating and a lot to learn out of this. I think I'm going to go back and watch this again just so I can try to absorb some more. But again, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, so again, Pierre, thank you for that fantastic set of insights and working through the questions. I hope all of you were tweeting during that session. Please remember the tweet out winners will be announced around 4 o'clock. And in all sincerity, I think finally I want to say thank you to everyone here and even those that were not able to attend this session. Thank you for making the choice to attend Propulsion and Energy 2016. I think it's been a fantastic week. I hope you guys think it's been a fantastic week. We look forward to doing it next year again in Atlanta, Georgia. It'll be a little bit earlier in July, but it's still going to be Georgia weather in the summer. So come prepared. But everybody have a safe finish to the rest of the week, safe travels, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone in Atlanta next year. Take care.